Hello, okay, so welcome to the next PowerPoint presentation. This one is on worldviews and background beliefs, and we'll just jump right in. So, cogent reasoning. Remember what is required of cogent reasoning. First, strength. Strength, or what sometimes is called validity too, this is what it was called in one of the texts, is the relationship of the premises to the conclusion. The reason why it's only strength or validity too is because cogent reasoning applies to inductive reasoning. So it's the relationship such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to be true. This is inductive reasoning, not deductive, where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Second, cogent reasoning requires believability of premises, whether they're justified. Thirdly, it requires the discovery and use of all the relevant information for analyzing the argument. And we talked a bit about validity in another PowerPoint presentation, so we'll be talking about these two a little bit more this time, although obviously we're not going to cover everything about them. We'll be talking about them more in other PowerPoint slides as well. Okay, so this is just an analogy. Soundness is to deductive validity, as cogency is to inductive strength. So soundness, if you recall, deals with deductive arguments, deductive validity, and cogency is dealing with inductive strength or inductive arguments. So sound arguments are deductively valid arguments with true premises. It requires the deductive validity and then something about the premises, true premises. Cogent arguments are inductively strong, or in some of the texts, valid two arguments with justified premises, don't necessarily know that they're true, and using all the relevant information. So what does this mean? Well, if you recall with the sound argument, if you have true premises, then the conclusion absolutely must be true, because a valid argument is one in which if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That's what it means for deduction. Strong arguments dealing with induction, on the other hand, means that the premises are true, the conclusion's more likely to be true. So cogent arguments are inductively strong arguments, sometimes called valid too, with justified premises and using all the relevant information. So the conclusion of a cogent argument is more likely to be true the stronger the argument is. Alright, kinds of background beliefs. Now, there could be more than these. There could be, for example, metaphysical background beliefs dealing with the nature of things that you think exist and so forth. These are two that one of the texts talks about: matters of fact and judgments about beliefs about value. So matters of fact, these are questions about the external world that can usually be settled with empirical or with abstract mathematical deductions. So these are questions that essentially you can figure out whether or not they correspond with reality. So here are some examples. Washington was the first U.S. president. Human genetic information is carried by DNA. The moon reflects sunlight. Mars is about 5 light minutes away from the Earth. We use only 10% of our brains. Notice that this one is in orange. That's because this is actually false. We don't only use 10% of our brains, we use all of our brains. But this is still a matter of fact, it just happens to be wrong. Matters of fact are things that can correspond with reality or not. So this is an issue of fact. By saying it's a matter of fact, that means it's an issue regarding fact. This one turns out to be wrong. So that's why I included a false example here. So what are matters of value? Well, matters of value, what the authors mean to group here are things like ethical judgments, judgments about beauty, judgments about the importance of relative things in your life, and these sorts of issues. These are largely subjective in some ways, difficult to determine with empirical tests or to deduce with mathematical or other abstract derivations. Now, this doesn't mean that they cannot be grounded in any way. So examples of these. The lives of my family are more important than the lives of strangers. Sophie Anderson's Take the Fair Face of a Woman is more beautiful than Van Gogh's Starry Night. It's better to be smart than to be strong. It's better to express yourself and stand out than conform and remain silent. New experiences are good, all other things being equal. People might have the reverse opinions on many of these things. And it would be very hard to correlate these with truth values in reality. But you got to be careful here, because just because it's difficult, that doesn't mean that some of these might not, in fact, be matters of fact. And in philosophy, lots of times there are arguments that many of these things are, in fact, matters of fact. Lots of ethical theories, for example, claim that they are, in fact, objectively true. Most ethical theories claim that at least some elements of them, if not the whole theory, is ethically true in some way. But it's still useful to make this division between matters of fact and matters of value here, because they wouldn't be empirically tested in the same sort of way. What they'll be tested with is using mostly abstract sorts of theories, and you'd have to sort of give an entire background of ethical theory to start to justify this sort of thing. So it would at least be more difficult and very much involved. But lots of these things, people and certainly philosophers often try to argue are more objective than many people might think. For example, in aesthetics, this theory of beauty, and in psychiatry, when they talk about beauty, lots of times people notice things like symmetry seems to be universally valued among people, regardless of what culture you're in. So there might be some issues in symmetry that are in some ways universal. There also seem to be some things, some qualities in what we consider masterworks of art that are shared. Other things, however, might be entirely subjective. For example, whether chocolate ice cream tastes better than strawberry. Well, people's taste buds are actually different. People literally taste things differently. Most people see the same spectrum of light. So if you're judging paintings, there might be a lot of similarities there. People tend to hear roughly the same spectrum of sound, although it changes a little bit as you get older. But people actually taste different chemicals. Not everybody tastes the same chemicals. Not everyone can smell the same things. And on top of that, it changes a great deal as you age. So those are far more subjective. And in fact, what you crave even varies based on the bacteria in your stomach and so forth. Okay, worldviews. So I put together just a collection of images here just to get you thinking about how worldviews might affect your background beliefs. So compare some child who's raised in a very tech-savvy background throughout their lives versus, say, a child who was raised in an Amish environment. Or somebody raised being ferried everywhere in a stretch limousine and in a mansion, living in a mansion, versus somebody who was raised in a house like this. Or compare and contrast how it might be to be raised in, say, a fundamentalist household versus a Muslim household versus a military family versus a family that goes to, I think this was Occupy Wall Street and does sing-alongs. Your experiences and your background beliefs might be very different. For example, if you were raised as an immigrant and you did this sort of work for a living. And they might be very different if you're one of the few people who are actually royalty and raised to think that your bloodline is special. So all these things might affect your background beliefs, and those background beliefs might affect who you take seriously, whose expertise you listen to, what sorts of things you value, what sorts of priorities you have, and so forth. So more about worldviews. They form part of our background beliefs. They can change, so there are many things that might change your background beliefs: new sets of friends, a new environment, radical life experiences, and so forth. They're influenced by culture, family, friends. They're even influenced by genetics. Lots of people don't realize that, but they are influenced by genetics. Twins separated by at birth, for example, will often share a lot more in common, say, with their political or religious views than you would expect of, say, two less genetically related individuals separated at birth and raised in different environments. That doesn't mean that they hold everything in common. So other things are obviously influencing them as well, but they hold more in common than would be statistically suspected that they would just by chance. And the effect of these worldviews on how we evaluate arguments is very hard for us to notice because we're completely immersed in them. There's an old saying that the last thing that a fish would notice is water. They're swimming through it, they're living in it, they're breathing it, or they're breathing through it. It's very hard to notice something like that. We don't tend to notice the air around us. Because of that, we're not going to usually notice these background beliefs that we take as just either common sense or background assumptions. We don't even tend to think about them. But if our goal is to A, arrive at the truth, and B, understand the reasoning behind our conclusions, then it's very important that we try to take a step back and evaluate these bits of evidence more objectively. So even if our background beliefs are right, even if our worldview happens to be right, we don't really understand our arguments unless we understand what the justification is behind these background beliefs that we're just sort of accepting. Okay, insufficiently grounded beliefs. We tend to want to hold on to our beliefs. When we've stated our beliefs to people, we even tend to want to hold on to them more strongly. So there's been studies where half the people will say what it is they believe about some piece they read, and then they're given some contrary information. They're less likely to change their mind than people who didn't say what they believed ahead of time and then are given contrary information. In addition, there are lots of psychological weaknesses that encourage us to maintain beliefs that we already have or generate the types of beliefs that we want. And these can cause us to make errors. Some of these types of psychological errors are confirmation bias, selective memory, projection bias, and there's a whole host of others. And they'll be mentioned later in the course. There are many kinds of background beliefs. Two that are mentioned are beliefs about the nature of human nature and beliefs about the reliability of information sources. The nature of human nature. So this would include questions like, what motivates people? Are people basically altruistic? Are they self-interested? Are they a little bit of both? Can people change their habits? How do people learn? What makes people happy? These sorts of things. Luckily, there's a whole host of theories out there already for us to analyze. We don't have to start from scratch. Reliability of information sources. And there's an old computer science saying, garbage in, garbage out. If you get bad information, your reasoning using this information is going to be bad as well. And here are just a list of lots of information sources: television, newspapers, magazines, Wikipedia, blogs, YouTube, textbooks, experts, and so forth. But what's important is that we shouldn't assume that sources are reliable without some sort of justification. Justification can be reputation from the past. Justification can be the types of sources they're using, can be individual reporters. It can be a whole host of things. But even when they're reliable, it's good to realize that oftentimes part of the story is missing. They might not know the whole story themselves. They might leave part of the story out because they don't realize the significance of it. They might leave part of it out deliberately. Oftentimes, even when generally reliable, the news will get certain types of complex stories wrong, especially scientific ones. They just don't understand the science, and so they'll report things wrongly. Other times, they'll report stories when they're just very sensational, but they're unlikely to be true. So you'll hear things like people claim to have spotted Bigfoot, and they have him frozen in a piece of ice or something like that. And it will turn out the next day that it was, a rubber suit. I mean, this happened not too long ago. And it was reported all over that, somebody thought they captured Bigfoot or something like that. And it turned out to be a rubber suit. They, of course, broadcasted all over the place that people thought they caught Bigfoot, and just little blurbs about it turning out to be a rubber suit. Because lots of people tune in to hear about Bigfoot perhaps being captured, and nobody wants to, first of all, they don't want to, say, oh, we reported this bad story. Second of all, people aren't as interested to turn in and watch about a rubber suit. So you have to worry about these things as well. Science. So the authors think science is especially reliable. And there are some reasons for this. Science has a method designed to improve objectivity, the scientific method. It's peer-reviewed. Other experts investigate the findings of original scientists and make sure that the findings are correct. These findings are repeatedly tested, and so forth. There are mathematical standards for showing statistically relevant results. So instead of saying, hey, look, I seem to notice this correlation here, they actually mathematically test the correlation and see if it's statistically significant. And usually you don't just do this on one occasion where something might just by chance appear to be statistically significant, but you do it several times. It produces broad theories that generate practical results. And by practical results, we mean results that can explain a wide range of phenomenon and also be used to produce technology. So we might not ourselves really fully understand, say, quantum physics or deep atomic theory that really explains how it is that material holds itself together even though it's mostly empty space, these sorts of things. But scientists tell us that it's these sorts of understandings that allow them to create things like transistors and microchips and the sorts of things that you're using to run your computer, to store electricity in batteries, to pick up radio waves, all these sorts of things. That it's not just a background theory that they can ignore. This theory was what allowed them to produce these things in the first place. It allows them to explain these things, and it allows them to continue to improve on these things. Finally, science is self-correcting. Lots of times people will say, well, look, science made a mistake. Well, yes, science sometimes makes a mistake, but when it does, it's almost always other scientists that catch it, and when they do, usually they end up with something closer to the truth. So oftentimes each step will move closer and closer to a model that seems more accurate. By the way, I'm sorry if you hear a cricket in the background. I've been trying to get it to shut up and I just can't seem to do it. So, now one of the problems with science is that most people don't really have the expertise to understand much of what scientists are up to or what they're doing. Some of it requires a moderate investment of time, some of it requires the dedication of years or even a lifetime of study. Luckily, with some investment of time, you can often understand enough to tell what's going on. But for some very difficult stuff, you're going to have to take expert advice, just like you have to take expert advice with a neuroscientist if you go in for some sort of brain scan because of health problems or any number of other things. But there are ways to vet out experts without being an expert yourself. Okay, that wraps up this particular PowerPoint. Talk to you next time.